January 7th, 1927. Hyde Park, New York. The temperature hovers at 15 degrees below zero, and the Hudson River has crystallized into a sheet of gray glass that stretches toward the Catskills like a mirror reflecting nothing. The cold is not merely winter, it is punitive, surgical in its precision. Inside the great mansion that once hosted cabinet members and Astors, the air carries the weight of impending finality, dried lavender, coal dust, and that peculiar stillness that announces the approach of death. In an upstairs chamber, beneath oil portraits of ancestors who conquered wilderness and built empires, James Roosevelt draws his final breath. He is 73 years old, bearer of the most repeated surname in American aristocracy, a name that stutters with privilege and echoes through the corridors of power. The redundancy of his nomenclature, James Roosevelt, seems almost prophetic now, as if his parents, in their dynastic ambition, had tried to double down on destiny itself. He dies not in scandal, which would at least imply passion, nor in poverty, which would suggest tragedy. He expires in something far more devastating for a man of his breeding: complete and utter irrelevance. The room where he breathes his last is attended only by a physician, whose name will never appear in any historical record, and a nurse who will forget his face before the week is out. There are no reporters camped at the gates, no telegrams arriving from European courts where he once served with distinction, no gathering of powerful men to hear final words of wisdom. There is only the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, measuring out the seconds of a legacy that is evaporating even before the body has grown cold. The cruelty of the timing cuts with exquisite precision. As James Roosevelt's soul departs this earth, the morning newspapers being printed in Manhattan carry stories not of his passing, but of his fifth cousin Franklin, who is preparing to assume the governorship of New York, the same position that launched Theodore toward the presidency. A generation earlier, the Roosevelt name thunders through American politics with renewed force, but James remains a genealogical footnote, a trivia answer to a question nobody is asking. Consider the inventory of advantages that should have guaranteed his immortality. James possessed everything the Gilded Age promised its most fortunate heirs: bloodlines tracing back to the original Dutch settlers of New Amsterdam, a Harvard education when Harvard still meant entrance into a brotherhood of power, marriage to Helen Schermerhorn Astor, daughter of the Mrs. Astor herself, the woman who literally decided who mattered in American society. Through this union, he became not merely wealthy, but untouchable, protected by the twin fortresses of Roosevelt political instinct and Astor real estate millions. He served his country in diplomatic posts across Europe during the delicate years when America was transforming from a provincial republic into a global power. He sat on boards that shaped American commerce and culture, summered in Newport where senators sought his counsel, moved through the highest circles of international society with the easy confidence of a man born to command respect. For 2 decades, he inhabited the role of the perfect American gentleman aristocrat, the living embodiment of what the Republic could produce, when it acknowledged that some men were simply born to lead. Yet, as the ghost of Theodore Roosevelt still thunders through history books, that rough riding, trust-busting force of nature who redefined the presidency as a pulpit for muscular progressivism, and as Franklin begins his meteoric ascent that will soon reshape the global order, James has become what he always feared most: a shadow heir, the Roosevelt who watched history pass him by from the window of a well-appointed drawing room. The mansion itself bears witness to his slow fade into obscurity. In the library downstairs, the evidence of his irrelevance has accumulated like dust. Portraits of Theodore dominate the walls: Theodore in his Rough Rider uniform, Theodore at his presidential desk, Theodore on safari in Africa. The newspapers stacked on mahogany tables chronicle Franklin's rising career, his recovery from polio transformed into a narrative of American resilience. Tucked away in drawers and filing cabinets lie James's own diplomatic commissions, his letters of introduction to European courts, his carefully preserved correspondence with men whose names once moved markets and toppled governments. Nobody has looked at these documents in years. Nobody will look at them after he is gone. The rooms that once hosted elaborate dinners for visiting dignitaries now sit shrouded in white sheets. The wine cellar that once stocked the finest vintages from France and Germany remains well maintained but rarely accessed. The library, with its leather-bound volumes on statecraft and its globe showing the world as it existed before the Great War, has become a mausoleum for a vanished era. James has lived long enough to become a ghost in his own house, haunting spaces that no longer recognize their purpose. The tragedy of James Roosevelt is not that he failed. Failure requires an attempt, a risk, a gamble lost. His tragedy was far quieter and far more corrosive, the tragedy of sufficiency. He possessed just enough money to never need to work, just enough status to never need to struggle, just enough comfort to numb the ambition that drove his kinsmen to greatness. He was the victim of a life made too easy, a stone in a river that was smoothed by the current but never moved with it. The friction that sharpens the soul was entirely absent from his existence. He had built a fortress to keep the vulgar world out, only to realize too late that he had locked himself in. The new century did not reward those who merely maintained their position. It rewarded those who seized the throat of destiny and demanded to be heard. But James had never demanded anything. He had only accepted his inheritance, his appointments, his comfortable, gilded cage. He was a man of the carriage era dying in the age of the airplane, a relic of a time when being a gentleman was a career in itself, unaware until the very end that the rules of the game had fundamentally changed. As the wind off the frozen Hudson rattles the window panes of the great house, signaling the final departure of the soul, we are confronted with the haunting question that defined his 73 years on this earth. It echoes through the empty hallways, bouncing off the portraits of the men who eclipsed him, reverberating through the silence of a world that had moved on without him. How does a man born to inherit a dynasty end up as a stranger to his own legacy? How does someone who possessed every conceivable advantage, the finest bloodlines, the most fortified bank accounts, the most polished education Europe could provide, become not just forgotten, but irrelevant while still breathing? This was not always his destiny. There was a time when James Roosevelt was the golden boy of the Hudson Valley, the Roosevelt that mattered most, the one groomed for the highest offices in the land. To understand how America's most privileged heir became its most forgotten ghost, we must leave this frozen room in 1927 and journey backward through the decades. We must return to 1854, when the Roosevelt name still whispered of merchant wealth rather than presidential power, and when a baby born with every advantage seemed destined to own the century that would eventually discard him like yesterday's newspaper. The year is 1854, and America itself is still young, uncertain, poised between the agrarian republic of its founding fathers and the industrial colossus it will become. New York remains a city of church steeples and counting houses rather than the vertical jungle of steel it will become, where the harbor carries the mingled scents of tar, salt air, and coal smoke, and where the fortunes being made are still considered slightly vulgar by the old Dutch families who predate the Republic itself. Into this moment of national adolescence, on March 27th in a brownstone on East 20th Street in Manhattan, arrives James Roosevelt, entering the world with a name that doubles down on destiny itself. The repetition is not accidental, not a clerical error or family eccentricity, but a declaration of genealogical intent. His mother is a Roosevelt, his father is a Roosevelt, and in the insular, mirror-lined ballroom of New York's Knickerbocker aristocracy, this redundancy of nomenclature serves as the ultimate seal of quality. The doubling of the family name functions like a kind of aristocratic insurance policy, as if his parents, in their dynastic ambition, understood that in a republic officially recognizing no nobility, emphasis would be required to guarantee remembrance. His father, James Roosevelt Sr., represents the old Dutch merchant aristocracy of New York, men whose ancestors arrived in New Amsterdam when it was still a trading post smelling of beaver pelts and salt air, when Wall Street was literally a wall, and fortunes were built on patient trading rather than industrial speculation. These are the Knickerbockers, the original families who transformed a colonial outpost into America's commercial heart. They are respectable, landed, civic-minded, but not yet legendary. The Roosevelts of this era occupy that peculiar American space between commerce and nobility, wealthy enough to never work with their hands, yet not so wealthy as to be vulgar about it. Their wealth whispers rather than screams, accumulated like sediment over generations of careful investment and prudent marriage. Young James grows up in what might be called the last golden moment of the Old Republic, that brief window between the Mexican War and the Civil War, when it still seemed possible that America might evolve into a kind of enlightened oligarchy, governed by men of breeding and education who understood that wealth carried obligations. Money moved with glacial slowness in this world, transferred through carefully drafted wills and strategic marriages rather than stock speculation or industrial conquest. Power was inherited rather than seized, passed down like the family silver, and polished with equal care. The Roosevelt household on East 20th Street embodied this philosophy of dignified accumulation. The rooms whispered good taste rather than screaming opulence, mahogany furniture built to last generations, portraits of ancestors who had fought in the Revolution, libraries stocked with Greek and Latin texts that the men of the family were actually expected to read and quote. Young James learned early that being a Roosevelt meant something specific: public service without showmanship, wealth without ostentation, authority announced through silence rather than volume. He was taught to speak 3 languages before he was 12, to recognize the difference between a Bordeaux and a Burgundy, and to understand that true power operated in the shadows of drawing rooms rather than the glare of public stages. His education followed the prescribed path of his caste with mathematical precision. Harvard, naturally, where he arrived in 1872 with trunks full of tailored suits and letters of introduction to Boston's first families. The Harvard of this era was less a university than a finishing school for the sons of America's merchant princes, where the curriculum focused less on vocational training and more on cementing the social bonds that would rule the Northeast for another 50 years. James studied history and political economy, joined the right clubs, rowed crew on the Charles River, and cultivated the easy confidence of a young man who had never been told that any door might be closed to him. Following Cambridge came the European polish, the grand tour that transformed American boys into American gentlemen. James spent 2 years moving through the capitals of the Old World, London, Paris, Vienna, Rome, absorbing the protocols of international diplomacy, learning how power operated in societies that had been practicing statecraft for centuries while America was still clearing forests. He attended salons where aging aristocrats discussed the balance of power over cognac, visited museums where the accumulated wealth of empires hung on walls, and came to understand that America, for all its democratic pretensions, was creating its own version of hereditary privilege. He returned to New York in 1877, 23 years old, polished to a high gloss, ready to assume his place in the careful machinery of American aristocracy. And then came the transformation that would define, and ultimately curse, his entire existence: his marriage to Helen Schermerhorn Astor. To understand what this union represented, one must grasp that Helen was not merely an heiress, but American royalty of a kind that made the Roosevelts look like ambitious shopkeepers. Her mother, Caroline Schermerhorn Astor, was the Mrs. Astor, the woman who single-handedly codified New York society and literally decided who mattered in American civilization. The famous 400, The number of people who could fit in Mrs. Astor's ballroom represented the absolute ceiling of social acceptability. To be invited was to exist. To be excluded was to be erased from the only society that mattered. When James Roosevelt married Helen Schermerhorn Astor in the spring of 1877, it should have been his coronation, the moment when potential crystallized into unassailable power. The union represented the perfect merger of two distinct strains of American authority, Roosevelt political instincts, and deep-rooted respectability wedded to the sheer, brute force of Astor real estate millions. Through this marriage, James became something more than merely wealthy. He became fortified, encased in a suit of armor made of Fifth Avenue limestone and Newport marble. He was now a living bridge between New York's old families and its newer fortunes, between the Van Rensselaers, who remembered Dutch New Amsterdam, and the Morgans, who were remaking America through steel and steam. For the next 20 years, James Roosevelt inhabited this rarefied world with absolute perfection. He accepted diplomatic postings to Vienna and London, not the most dangerous or demanding roles, but the most socially prestigious. He moved through European courts not as a striver, but as an equal to the aristocracy he encountered, the ideal representative of a nation that wanted to be taken seriously by old-world powers. Back in America, he served on the boards that shaped the nation's cultural and economic life, his name appearing on letterheads that opened doors and moved capital. Summers were spent in Newport, where senators sought his counsel over whiskey and cigars on marble terraces overlooking the Atlantic. He was the Roosevelt that other Roosevelts aspired to become. When distant cousins needed letters of introduction, they wrote to James. When the family required representation at important occasions, James was dispatched. He embodied the promise that the Roosevelt name, properly cultivated and strategically deployed, could secure a position at the very apex of American society. He had achieved what the Gilded Age considered the highest form of success. He had become indispensable to the machinery of power without ever appearing to seek power himself. But in the autumn of 1901, a single gunshot in Buffalo would shatter James's comfortable world forever. Not because it killed President William McKinley, though that was tragedy enough, but because it created a president named Theodore Roosevelt, and in that creation, redefined forever what it meant to bear the family name. September 14th, 1901. The oath of office is administered not in the grand rotunda of the Capitol, but in the parlor of a Buffalo mansion still heavy with the scent of death, where William McKinley's blood has barely dried on the mahogany floors. Theodore Roosevelt, James's half-nephew, raises his right hand and becomes President of the United States at age 42, the youngest man ever to hold the office. The photographs from that afternoon show a compact, vigorous figure with blazing eyes and barely contained energy, as though the solemn ceremony is merely an obstacle between him and his manifest destiny. For the American public, gathering around their newspapers from Boston to San Francisco, it represents the dawn of a dynamic new era, the ascension of youth and muscular energy to an office that had been occupied by aging Civil War veterans for an entire generation. The nation, poised on the threshold of the 20th century, senses instinctively that this is the sort of leader it now requires, not a careful steward of the status quo, but a force of nature who will reshape the very conception of American power. For James Roosevelt, reading the telegrams as they arrive in his Fifth Avenue drawing room, surrounded by portraits of ancestors who conquered wilderness through patient accumulation rather than dramatic gesture, it marks the beginning of a slow, suffocating eclipse from which he will never emerge. The tectonic plates of his carefully constructed world have shifted violently, and he finds himself standing on the wrong side of history's great divide. The initial shock is not jealousy. James is far too well-bred for such naked emotion, but rather a profound disorientation, as if the fundamental laws governing his universe have been rewritten without consultation or warning. Theodore, after all, represents the other branch of the family tree, the Oyster Bay Roosevelts, who were always considered slightly less refined than James's Hyde Park lineage. Theodore's father had actually worked for his money, rather than merely managing inherited wealth, and Theodore himself had been that sickly child who compensated for physical weakness with an almost manic overcompensation, charging through life with all the subtlety of a cavalry assault. Yet here he stands, master of the most powerful office on earth, while James, at 47, has achieved nothing more remarkable than being appropriately connected and strategically married. The flaw in James's character, invisible during the genteel, gaslit decades of the 1880s and 1890s when being a gentleman was sufficient qualification for leadership, now becomes glaringly, painfully apparent under the harsh electric glare of the new century. He is constitutionally suited for a world that is rapidly vanishing, a world of quiet influence and drawing room diplomacy, where power operates through whispered suggestions rather than public declarations. For James, restraint is not merely a virtue, but an identity, bred into his bones across generations of careful cultivation. Theodore embodies something entirely different and entirely alien to James's understanding of proper authority. He is the first truly modern president, grasping instinctively that in an age of mass circulation newspapers and telegraph wires, visibility equals power. Where James measures his words with the precision of a jeweler setting diamonds, Theodore hurls his opinions into the public square like a man throwing punches. Where James is content to be respected by those who matter, Theodore insists on being unforgettable to everyone. The contrast between their parallel lives becomes a kind of exquisite torture that plays out across every dimension of their existence. While Theodore had charged up San Juan Hill in Cuba, making himself a war hero through sheer audacity and providential luck, James had served competently, but invisibly, in European embassies, filing diplomatic reports that were read, noted, and forgotten. Where Theodore now dominates newspaper headlines with his trust-busting crusades and his big-stick diplomacy, James merits only society page mentions, attending this charity benefit, hosting that diplomatic reception, always present but never consequential. Where Theodore reshapes the presidency itself, transforming it from a largely ceremonial office into the commanding heights of American power, James watches from what might be called the family box seats, close enough to observe every detail, but forever separated from the action by an invisible barrier of temperament and timing. The psychological cruelty is refined to an almost artistic degree precisely because it cannot be articulated without appearing petty or grasping. James possesses every advantage that should, by the old calculations of hierarchy, have made him the dominant figure. His genealogy is more distinguished, his bloodlines more carefully cultivated across generations of strategic marriages. He commands vastly greater personal wealth. The Astor fortune dwarfs anything Theodore can claim from his modest inheritance. His social connections span the Atlantic, reaching into the crowned courts of Europe, where he moves with an ease that Theodore, for all his bluster and energy, can never quite achieve. Yet none of this matters, not one bit of it. The currency of power has changed, and James finds himself holding a vault full of Confederate dollars in a world that now trades only in gold. In an age that rewards dynamism over decorum, energy over elegance, the man who projects strength wins, and James Roosevelt has been trained his entire life never to raise his voice above a gentleman's murmur. He begins to understand, with the slow horror of a man watching his own execution, that he is not the Roosevelt who will be remembered by history. He is merely the Roosevelt who was there, a supporting character in someone else's drama, the impeccably dressed extra visible in the background of photographs that will illustrate Theodore's biography. The American public falls in love with Teddy, the gleaming teeth, the wire-rimmed spectacles, the relentless energy that seems to vibrate through newspaper photographs. Theodore dominates the front pages with his every hunting expedition and policy declaration, his personality so large it requires bold headlines to contain it. James, meanwhile, finds himself relegated to the society columns, his name appearing in small print alongside lists of attendees at embassy receptions and museum board meetings. He continues to serve in his diplomatic roles, first Secretary of the Legation in Vienna, Secretary of the Embassy in London, but he serves invisibly, becoming the man who arranges the furniture for history while Theodore occupies the chair. The family gatherings become exercises in careful, ritualized humiliation. Christmas at Oyster Bay, Thanksgiving at Sagamore Hill, weddings and christenings where the Roosevelt clan assembles to celebrate its growing prominence, James attends them all, and at each one he feels his status, subtly but unmistakably diminishing. He is the elder statesman, the man who should by rights of age and accomplishment be the patriarch, but he finds himself increasingly treated as a ceremonial figure rather than a source of wisdom or guidance. The younger, hungrier Roosevelts, Theodore's boisterous children, the ambitious Franklin, the whole energetic brood that seems to multiply with each passing year, gravitate toward the president like iron filings drawn to a magnet. They want to discuss naval expansion, trust-busting, the Panama Canal project that will cement American dominance over global commerce. They speak a language of action and imperial ambition that James finds both distasteful and incomprehensible. When he speaks, offering cautionary observations drawn from his years navigating European courts, the table grows politely quiet. They listen with the indulgent patience one reserves for an elderly relative recounting stories everyone has heard before, waiting for him to finish so they can return to the urgent business of the future. James can see, with crystalline clarity, where Theodore's impetuousness will lead to trouble. The younger man's tendency to personalize political conflicts, his naive faith in American exceptionalism, his aggressive style that European diplomats find barbaric, these are flaws that James's more sophisticated understanding of international politics allows him to identify immediately. He could offer counsel, could share insights gained from years of observing how power operates in societies that have been practicing statecraft for centuries. But he is never asked, and to offer unsolicited advice would be to admit his own irrelevance, to reveal the desperation beneath his carefully maintained dignity. During Theodore's presidency, James visits the White House on several occasions, walking through corridors that, by rights of seniority and breeding, he perhaps felt better suited to occupy. The building buzzes with a frantic energy that mirrors the president's own temperament, staff members rushing through hallways with the urgency of people who believe they are changing the world. In the official photographs from these visits, James appears as a tall, impeccably dressed figure with a carefully trimmed mustache, always slightly out of focus, always positioned just behind someone more important. He is the visual definition of also present, forever relegated to the margins of his own family's triumph. He watches Theodore expand executive power until it touches every aspect of American life, intervening in coal strikes, creating national parks, sending the Great White Fleet around the world as a demonstration of American naval might. Theodore transforms the presidency into what he calls a bully pulpit, using it to shape public opinion and drive national policy in ways that would have been unthinkable to previous occupants of the office. James, by contrast, views government as a stewardship, a solemn duty to maintain established order and preserve carefully negotiated balances. He cannot comprehend Theodore's desire to disrupt, to challenge, to fight battles that could be settled quietly through proper channels. As the years of Theodore's presidency accumulate like sediment, James retreats deeper into the rituals and protocols that represent the only realm where he still exercises unquestioned authority. He becomes a curator of his own obsolescence, polishing his manners until they shine like armor, using etiquette as a shield against the chaotic energy of the new century. If he cannot be the most powerful man in the room, he will be the most correct, maintaining the elaborate social machinery of the Gilded Age even as the world around him abandons it for cruder but more effective methods of wielding influence. The irony corrodes his confidence like acid on silver. James is arguably the superior diplomat, possessing a nuanced understanding of European courts and the delicate balance of egos and histories that maintains international stability. But the world no longer wants diplomats. It wants leaders who carry big sticks. James carries a walking cane, and he uses it for support, not intimidation. The careful protocols that once made him indispensable, knowing which fork to use, understanding the nuances of diplomatic precedents, maintaining the elaborate social rituals of international society, have become as relevant as knowing how to load a musket in the age of machine guns. His marriage to Helen, once the cornerstone of his identity and the source of his social invulnerability, begins to show hairline cracks under the pressure of his diminishment. She spends increasing amounts of time in Europe, where the Roosevelt name still carries diplomatic cachet, but not the burden of constant comparison to Theodore's overwhelming presence. When she returns to New York, James notices how her attention wanders when he discusses his committee work, how she changes the subject when he attempts to analyze political developments with the thoroughness they deserve. She had married the Roosevelt who was supposed to matter, and while she is too sophisticated and well-bred to voice her disappointment, it hangs in the air between them like expensive perfume turning stale. The newspapers that once treated James with respectful deference now mention him only in relation to Theodore, the president's cousin, a relative of the Roosevelt family, never simply James Roosevelt standing alone as his own man with his own accomplishments. His diplomatic appointments are not renewed when they expire. Younger men, Theodore's protégés who share his energy and his vision, are dispatched to the courts where James once represented American interests with quiet competence. The message is transmitted without ever being explicitly stated. The old world of genteel influence has been replaced by something louder, more aggressive, more democratic in its vulgarity. By 1905, as Theodore wins election in his own right with the largest popular majority in American history, James Roosevelt has become what he will remain for the rest of his life, a living museum piece, a representative of a style of American leadership that the nation has outgrown like a childhood suit of clothes. He is only 51 years old, wealthy beyond the dreams of most men, socially prominent, physically healthy, and completely, utterly irrelevant to the great currents of his time. He consoles himself with the belief that Theodore's presidency represents a temporary madness, that the country will eventually tire of such theatrical governance and return to the sanity of the old ways. He tells himself that true breeding, genuine cultivation, will always outlast the fleeting popularity of the mob. But deep in his heart, in the quiet hours before dawn when a man confronts his truest thoughts, James begins to suspect that he is wrong. The genie has escaped from its bottle, and there will be no coaxing it back inside. As Theodore's star blazed across the national sky with an intensity that seemed to consume all the oxygen in the room, James retreated deeper into the shadows of privilege, unaware that his greatest test was approaching, not from the political arena where he had already been definitively defeated, but from the most intimate chambers of his own carefully constructed life, from the most personal betrayal of all. By 1910, James Roosevelt inhabits a peculiar form of marital exile, a condition so rarefied that it lacks proper terminology in any social lexicon, because it occurs only among those whose wealth makes conventional unhappiness impossible to acknowledge. His marriage to Helen Schermerhorn Astor, once the glittering cornerstone of his identity and the foundation upon which he had constructed his entire sense of self-worth, has evolved over 3 decades into an elaborate performance, a theatrical production staged for an audience of society. Columnists and family members who must be convinced that all remains as it should be in the stratosphere, where Astors and Roosevelts conduct their increasingly hollow lives. The architecture of their separation is maintained with exquisite, almost artistic care. Helen spends the greater portion of each year in Europe, 6 months in Paris, extended stays in London, summers at rented villas along the Mediterranean, where she moves through international society with the fluid grace of someone who has never been told that any door might be closed to her. In these continental settings, the Roosevelt name still carries genuine diplomatic cachet, still opens the salons of aging duchesses and the drawing rooms of ministers who remember when America was a curiosity rather than a rival. Most crucially, in Europe, Helen escapes the suffocating shadow of Theodore's omnipresence, the relentless newspaper headlines and exhausting comparisons that make every Roosevelt gathering in America feel like a referendum on James's fundamental inadequacy. They correspond regularly, letters arriving on cream-colored stationery embossed with the Astor crest, filled with observations about European politics and descriptions of parties attended by people whose names appear in no American newspapers. The correspondence maintains the elaborate fiction of a marriage that has simply been temporarily interrupted by geography, rather than fundamentally hollowed out by mutual disappointment. When Helen returns to New York for the obligatory social season, they appear together at the Metropolitan Opera, at museum galas, at charity benefits that require the presence of both an Astor and a Roosevelt to achieve maximum social impact. They sit side by side, their bodies occupying the same velvet-lined boxes while their minds inhabit entirely separate continents. James, meanwhile, finds himself trapped in a role he never consciously chose and never wanted, the caretaker of other people's legacies. His days are consumed by the administrative minutiae of managing vast fortunes he did not create and properties he did not build. He reviews leases for Astor buildings, approves renovations to tenements and office blocks that will bear Helen's family name long after his own has been forgotten by everyone except genealogists. He serves on Roosevelt memorial committees, helping to plan statues and museums dedicated to Theodore's achievements, forced to smile for photographers at dedication ceremonies, celebrating a greatness that makes his own diplomatic accomplishments appear microscopic by comparison. He attends an endless succession of functions, where he is introduced not as James Roosevelt, diplomat, Harvard graduate, man of letters, but as Theodore's relative, or, more devastatingly, as Helen's husband, his entire identity reduced to a footnote in someone else's biography. The psychological architecture of the spare heir becomes painfully, humiliatingly clear during these years of slow calcification. James has spent his entire existence preparing to be important, absorbing lessons in leadership and statecraft, cultivating the skills and international connections that should have guaranteed him a position of consequence in American life. He had believed, with the naive faith of his class, that importance was a destination one arrived at through proper breeding, correct behavior, and patient adherence to the protocols of power. Only now, in what should be the prime of his influence, does he discover the brutal truth that importance cannot be inherited like real estate or accumulated like interest in a bank account. Importance must be seized, claimed through acts of will that announce to the world that you refuse to be ignored, that you demand to be reckoned with. And seizing requires a ruthlessness, a willingness to elbow aside competitors and demand attention, that James's entire upbringing was specifically designed to breed out of him as thoroughly as a gardener removes weeds from a formal garden. He had been raised to believe that a gentleman never pushes himself forward, never seeks the spotlight, never engages in the vulgar self-promotion that characterized the new industrial millionaires. These lessons, absorbed in childhood and reinforced through decades of social conditioning, have become a kind of psychological prison, more secure than any physical bars. James cannot transform himself into a Theodore, cannot suddenly develop the aggressive energy and shameless self-advertising that the 20th century rewards, any more than a hothouse orchid can survive transplantation to the wilderness. He is a creature bred for a specific environment, and that environment has vanished as completely as the gaslight era it represented. In response to his shrinking relevance, James develops the habits of the chronically overlooked, behaviors that become more pronounced and more desperate with each passing year. There is, first, an almost obsessive attention to protocol, as if by executing the elaborate rituals of his class with perfect precision, he can somehow prove his superiority to those who ignore him. He arrives at every function exactly on time, not fashionably late, which would suggest casualness, but precisely when the invitation specifies, demonstrating his respect for proper form. His correspondence becomes a masterpiece of correct usage, each letter a small work of art in penmanship and phrasing, as if the perfection of his prose might somehow compensate for the irrelevance of its content. He insists on the elaborate protocols of calling cards and formal introductions, even as younger members of society begin to adopt the more casual American manners that Theodore had made fashionable. He maintains his dignity with a desperation that becomes increasingly visible to those who know him well, polishing it like an heirloom silver service that no one uses anymore. He continues to dress for dinner every evening, even when dining alone in his Fifth Avenue mansion, changing into formal attire as if the ritual itself possesses some protective power against the encroaching chaos of modernity. He maintains a staff of servants trained in the old ways, men and women who understand the precise hierarchy of service that was standard in the 1880s, but which now seems as antiquated as powdered wigs. Rather than adapting to the changing tempo of the age, James doubles down on forms and customs that the world around him is abandoning with accelerating speed. The world is changing with dizzying, almost violent rapidity, and James finds himself constitutionally unable to change with it. Automobiles begin to replace carriages on Fifth Avenue, their harsh mechanical roar drowning out the civilized clip-clop of horses' hooves that had provided the soundtrack to his youth. The income tax, that most vulgar of democratic innovations, passes into law in 1913, forcing even the wealthiest families to account for their fortunes to government bureaucrats who show no deference to ancient names or inherited position. The suffragette movement gains momentum, threatening to upend the careful gender hierarchies that had organized society for centuries. Labor unions grow powerful, challenging the natural order that placed men like James at the apex of civilization simply by virtue of their birth. The cruel paradox of James's situation is that his wealth, the Astor fortune that should have insulated him from every possible hardship, has become the primary instrument of his imprisonment. He possesses enough money that he never needs to work, never needs to prove himself in the marketplace, never needs to develop the skills that might have made him relevant to the emerging order. His income arrives like clockwork, requiring nothing from him except the ability to sign his name on documents prepared by attorneys and accountants. He is wealthy enough to maintain the fiction of importance, the Fifth Avenue mansion, the Newport cottage, the European travel, but not wealthy enough to reshape the world to his specifications the way a Rockefeller or a Morgan might. He has become a living museum piece, perfectly preserved and exquisitely maintained, but utterly obsolete for any practical purpose. His relationship with Helen, when she deigns to occupy the same continent, ossifies into something at once stable and profoundly lonely. They move through their shared spaces like ghosts haunting the same mansion, occupying the same rooms but inhabiting entirely different realities. When they speak, it is with the unfailing politeness of strangers forced to share a railway carriage, never raising their voices or acknowledging the fundamental emptiness at the heart of their union. Love, if it still exists between them, has become a luxury neither feels entitled to claim. Affection has been replaced by obligation, intimacy by correctness, passion by the careful maintenance of appearances. The servants, who see everything and say nothing, understand the truth that cannot be spoken in polite society. They maintain two separate households within the same physical structure: Helen's apartments with their French furniture and her correspondence with European nobility, James's library with its diplomatic memorabilia and its shelves of books on statecraft that no one consults anymore. The marriage has become a business arrangement, a merger of family interests that continues because dissolution would be more scandalous than continuation, and because neither party can imagine an alternative that would not represent a humiliating admission of failure. By 1914, as spring arrives in New York with its usual promise of renewal that feels increasingly hollow, James Roosevelt has settled into patterns that will define the remainder of his days on Earth. He is 59 years old, wealthy beyond the dreams of most men, socially prominent in circles that matter less each year, and profoundly, irredeemably alone. He has become exactly what he was raised to be: dignified, proper, impeccably mannered, only to discover that the world no longer values these qualities, if it ever truly did. He is a success at a game that history has stopped playing, a champion of protocols that no one remembers or cares about. In 1914, as the old world literally exploded into war, as the empires and monarchies that James understood began their march toward mutual destruction, James Roosevelt would face the choice that defines every man of his generation: adapt to the brutal realities of the 20th century, or accept his final transformation into a relic of the 19th, a curiosity to be preserved in the amber of memory rather than a force to be reckoned with in the living world. August 1914 arrives not with the gentle rustle of society pages or the measured tick of drawing room clocks, but with the thunderous finality of a civilization committing suicide. The Great War erupts across Europe, transforming a summer that should have been remembered for Newport garden parties and leisurely transatlantic crossings into the opening movement of industrial slaughter. In a matter of weeks, the delicate web of royal intermarriages and diplomatic protocols that James Roosevelt understood so intimately, the careful balance of power he had spent decades learning to navigate, collapses into trenches carved from French mud and German efficiency. For James, now 60 years old and bearing the accumulated weight of 2 decades spent watching history pass him by, this cataclysm initially appears as a perverse form of salvation. The assassination of an Austrian archduke in a Balkan backwater triggers a cascade of mobilizations that should, by every logical calculation, restore his relevance to American public life. Who else possesses his depth of diplomatic experience, his intimate knowledge of the European courts now directing armies toward mutual annihilation? He has dined with the ministers who are drawing battle lines, walked the marble corridors of the chancelleries now issuing declarations of war. His address book reads like a roster of the men whose miscalculations are reshaping the world. For the first time since Theodore's ascension shattered his comfortable existence, James allows himself to nurture a quiet, almost guilty hope that circumstances might finally align with his preparation. Instead, the war becomes the stage for his final, most exquisite humiliation, a 4-year demonstration that even global catastrophe cannot restore his significance to the American story. The summons to Washington never comes. President Woodrow Wilson, that former academic whose Presbyterian sensibilities regard the old diplomatic establishment with barely concealed contempt, turns not to seasoned ambassadors schooled in European court etiquette, but to a new breed of technocrats and progressive advisors. These are men unencumbered by personal relationships with the monarchs whose world is burning, unburdened by sympathy for the aristocratic system that produced the disaster. Wilson wants analysts who can think strategically about American interests rather than gentlemen who worry about offending European sensibilities. The president seeks architects of a new international order, not curators of the old one. James writes letters offering his services, his insights, his unparalleled connections. The responses, when they arrive at all, are masterpieces of polite dismissal, thanking him for his patriotic spirit, while making devastatingly clear that the administration has no use for a man whose expertise is rooted in a world that no longer exists. His diplomatic experience, far from being an asset, has become a liability. He is too invested in the old system, too sympathetic to the European aristocracy, too incapable of imagining that the careful protocols he had mastered might be replaced by something entirely different. The very knowledge that should make him indispensable now marks him as obsolete. The contrast within his own extended family cuts with surgical precision. Theodore's sons, Ted Jr., Kermit, Archie, and Quentin, rush toward the sound of the guns with the same heedless courage that had defined their father's charge up San Juan Hill. They enlist, they train, they ship out to France to lead men into the mechanized hell of the Western Front. They are the gladiators of the new century, proving their worth in blood and iron. Quentin, the youngest and most beloved, dies in aerial combat over France in July 1918, shot down in flames at age 20. The nation mourns him as a hero, another Roosevelt who gave everything for his country, his death sanctifying the family name as synonymous with martial sacrifice. Franklin, that ambitious fifth cousin whom James had watched with a mixture of affection and wariness, transforms the conflict into his personal finishing school. As Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Franklin oversees the expansion of American naval power, makes crucial decisions about convoy protection and ship construction, establishes relationships with military leaders that will serve him for decades. While James attends charity meetings in New York, Franklin is in Washington directing the movement of fleets, his signature on orders that transport thousands of men across the Atlantic. The war becomes Franklin's crucible, the forge where he transforms from a promising young politician into a figure of genuine substance. And James? James serves on committees. He organizes charity drives for Belgian relief and war orphans, writing checks that others will distribute to recipients he will never meet. He sits on boards that coordinate Liberty Bond drives, his presence at fundraising galas lending the social credibility of old New York to the war effort. He attends endless meetings where his name appears in the minutes. Mr. James Roosevelt spoke briefly on the importance of maintaining morale, but his words are never quoted, never analyzed, never remembered beyond the moment of their utterance. He becomes the Roosevelt who is always there, but never necessary, occupying space in group photographs without contributing anything that could not be provided by any other well-dressed gentleman of appropriate breeding. The psychological devastation is total and irreversible. In those early months of American neutrality, James had believed that when the moment of supreme crisis arrived, when the nation needed men who understood the old world's complexities, his expertise would finally be recognized as indispensable. Instead, he discovers that the war has made his knowledge not merely irrelevant, but actively undesirable. The elaborate protocols of European diplomacy, the careful maintenance of relationships with aristocratic families, the nuanced understanding of centuries-old territorial disputes, all of this strikes the Wilson administration as precisely the sort of thinking that created the disaster in the first place. He must endure the peculiar torture of being congratulated for achievements that belong to others. Well, meaning acquaintances assume he must be so proud of his family's contribution to the war effort, conflating him with Franklin's naval service or Theodore's son's heroism. He must smile and accept credit for influence he does not possess, for sacrifices he did not make, for relevance he cannot claim. The Roosevelt name thunders through American headlines, but James has become merely its custodian rather than its embodiment. The war strips away the last pretenses of the Gilded Age with the brutal efficiency of machine gun fire cutting through cavalry charges. The federal income tax, initially a modest levy on the wealthy, expands voraciously to fund the war machine, transforming James's relationship with his own fortune from absolute ownership to something more like government-supervised stewardship. Each quarterly payment represents another erosion of the principle that capital, once accumulated, should compound across generations without interference from democratic majorities. The careful social machinery that once made men like James indispensable, the elaborate protocols of who knew whom, who could introduce whom to whom, who possessed the standing to open which doors, is swept away by the brutal efficiency of total war. The conflict demands results, not pedigree. It rewards competence, not connections. The ability to move 1,000 tons of steel overnight matters more than knowing the correct form of address for a Habsburg prince. Women enter the workforce in unprecedented numbers, labor unions gain legitimacy as essential partners in production, and the rigid hierarchies of James's youth begin to crumble under the weight of democratic necessity. By the time the armistice is signed in November 1918, James Roosevelt has undergone a transformation as complete as any suffered by the European empires themselves. At 64, he possesses the same wealth, the same social connections, the same carefully cultivated manners that had once guaranteed his position at the apex of American society. But the society itself has changed beyond recognition. America emerges from the conflict as an undisputed global power, confident and modern, with little patience for the elaborate courtesies of a vanished age. The Roosevelt name has never been more powerful or more prominent in American life. Theodore's legacy, burnished by his son's sacrifices, continues to shape national politics even after his death in January 1919. Franklin stands poised to launch a career that will eventually surpass even Theodore's achievements. The family has become synonymous with American dynamism, with the vigorous assertion of national will that the 20th century demands. Yet James, who shares their blood and bears their name, who commands greater personal wealth and deeper social connections than either of them, has been rendered completely superfluous to their collective triumph. He is not merely less successful than his kinsmen, he is fundamentally different from them in ways that matter more than breeding or education or inherited position. Theodore and Franklin understood instinctively that power in the modern age must be seized and wielded, that leadership requires the willingness to fight battles and accept risks. James had been raised to believe that authority was something one inherited and maintained, that leadership meant preserving what previous generations had built rather than tearing down old structures to create new ones. The war has proven, with the finality of an artillery barrage which approached the 20th century will reward. James has become what he always feared most, a living anachronism in his own family's triumph, a cautionary tale about the dangers of being perfectly suited for a world that no longer exists. He retreats to his Fifth Avenue mansion, to the quiet rooms where European portraits gather dust and the telephone rarely rings, understanding at last that he has lived too long and adapted too little. As the guns fall silent, and America prepares to enter the decade that will define the modern age, James Roosevelt stands at the threshold of his final years with the quiet recognition that the world has moved on without him. The 1920s would bring prosperity and possibility to America, jazz music and radio broadcasts, everything vibrant and modern and utterly alien to the man he had been raised to become. But for James himself, the new decade would bring only the final, quiet recognition of his own irrelevance, a long twilight spent haunting the margins of a future that should have been his to command. The 1920s arrive not with the gentle transition of one season to another, but as a violent assault on everything James Roosevelt had been raised to consider permanent. The decade explodes into existence with the syncopated rebellion of jazz music pouring from Harlem nightclubs and Fifth Avenue speakeasies, with the static crackle of radio broadcasts that collapse the distance between the White House and the most anonymous farmhouse, with the hemline shortening. Defiance of flappers who smoke cigarettes in public and drive automobiles with scandalous independence. It arrives with income taxes that demand an accounting of every inherited dollar, transforming private fortunes into matters of public record, with women's suffrage that overturns centuries of political tradition, with prohibition that makes criminals of gentlemen who wish to serve proper, cocktails in their own drawing rooms. Everything about this new world makes James's carefully constructed existence seem suddenly, painfully ancient, not merely old-fashioned, but as distant and incomprehensible as hieroglyphics carved by vanished civilizations. At 66 years old, He possesses the finest constitution that clean living and expensive medical care can provide, commands wealth that has grown rather than diminished during the prosperous decade, and maintains his position among New York's most exclusive social circles. By every objective measure, he has won the game of life. Yet he inhabits the roaring 20s with the bewildered air of a man who is awakened to discover that the fundamental laws of physics have been rewritten overnight. He has become what corporations call legacy infrastructure, too established to discard outright, too outdated to expand or modernize, a sunk cost in human form. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, that younger cousin whose political career James had observed with a mixture of familial pride and aristocratic skepticism, begins his inexorable march toward the presidency with a determination that seems to mock James's own passivity. The polio that strikes Franklin down in 1921 should, by all reasonable calculations, end his public life. Instead, it becomes a brutal reconfiguration that transforms physical vulnerability into political strength. Franklin emerges from his ordeal at Warm Springs not diminished, but somehow enlarged, having learned to project resilience in ways that resonate with a democratic electorate. He masters the new media, understanding instinctively that leadership in the 20th century requires not just competence, but performance, not just wisdom, but charisma. James finds himself cast in the only role that remains available to him, the family elder who provides continuity but not leadership, the living embodiment of dynastic depth wheeled out for ceremonial occasions. He becomes the Roosevelt who is consulted on genealogy when younger family members need to verify their connection to some Revolutionary War ancestor. He is invited to dedications of Theodore Roosevelt memorials, his presence at ribbon-cutting ceremonies lending the gravitas of age and bloodline to celebrations of achievements that are not his own. He poses for photographs that will illustrate magazine articles about the Roosevelt dynasty's deep roots, standing stiffly in formal attire, while photographers position him as the visual representation of historical continuity. But the silence surrounding his actual opinions grows more deafening with each passing year. He is never asked what he thinks about the League of Nations debate that is tearing apart the international order he understands so intimately. He is never consulted on prohibition, despite his years navigating the complexities of European diplomatic entertaining. He is never invited into the smoke-filled rooms where Franklin and his advisors plot the path to power. When the family gathers at Hyde Park for holidays and special occasions, James listens to conversations about trust-busting and labor relations and foreign policy with the polite attention of a man attending a lecture delivered in a language he does not speak. His occasional interjections about European diplomatic precedents are received with respectful silence before the conversation rushes forward again, leaving him stranded on the margins of his own family's triumph. His daily routines become elaborate rituals of dignified irrelevance. He rises at 7 each morning and breakfasts alone while reading newspapers that chronicle a world he cannot influence. His mornings are consumed by the administrative minutiae of managing store properties, reviewing leases, approving expenditures, signing documents prepared by attorneys and accountants who make the actual decisions while preserving the fiction that he remains in control. His afternoons disappear into committee meetings for museum boards and charitable organizations, where his presence is valued primarily because his name still opens checkbooks and his signature on letterhead still carries weight with potential donors. The clubs where he maintains memberships, the Union Club, the Knickerbocker Club, the Century Association, provide sanctuaries where men of his generation can pretend that nothing fundamental has changed. But even these bastions of tradition are slowly transforming, admitting younger members who treat the elaborate protocols with barely concealed impatience, who use the mahogany-paneled rooms primarily for business meetings, conducted at a pace that would have been considered vulgar in James's youth. He sits in the reading room surrounded by newspapers chronicling events he cannot influence, occasionally exchanging pleasantries with other elderly members who share his displacement but never acknowledge it explicitly. His marriage to Helen has evolved into an elaborate performance staged for an audience of society columnists and family members who must be convinced that all remains as it should be in the rarefied atmosphere where Astors and Roosevelts conduct their increasingly hollow lives. She spends the greater portion of each year in Europe now, maintaining residences in Paris and London, where the Roosevelt name still carries diplomatic cachet, but not the burden of constant comparison to Theodore and Franklin. When she returns to New York for the obligatory social season, they appear together at the Metropolitan Opera and Museum galas, sitting side by side in velvet-lined boxes while their minds inhabit entirely separate continents. They correspond regularly on cream-colored stationery, maintaining the elaborate fiction of a marriage temporarily interrupted by geography, rather than fundamentally hollowed out by mutual disappointment. Their interactions have been polished to such perfection they could be staged at the Metropolitan Opera, each playing their role with flawless technique and complete emotional detachment. The cruelest irony corrodes what remains of his sense of purpose with the slow, inexorable persistence of rust-consuming iron. James lives to see the Roosevelt name achieve its greatest heights, while his own contribution to that achievement becomes increasingly invisible, erased from the narrative as thoroughly as if he had never existed. He knows with the bitter clarity of the overlooked that he played a crucial role in the family's ascent. He was the bridge builder, the man who maintained the Roosevelt social standing during the wilderness years when they were respectable but not legendary. He preserved their connections to European aristocracy when they were merely merchant sons trying to be taken seriously by established power. He elevated the family's status from prominent to unassailable through his marriage to the Astors, providing the financial and social fortification that allowed the next generation to take risks without worrying about their fundamental acceptability. Without James's patient accumulation of social capital, would Theodore have been embraced so readily by the establishment he sought to reform? Would Franklin have found so many doors open to him as he climbed the political ladder? James was the architect of the stage upon which others would perform their dramas, and like all architects of stages, he was destined to be forgotten once the curtain rose on the main event. History rewards action, noise, the visible exercise of power. History will remember Theodore's charge up San Juan Hill and Franklin's fireside chats. It will not remember the quiet man who kept the name respectable while others made it legendary, who ensured that the checks cleared and the invitations were answered and the social fabric remained intact. He spends his evenings alone in the Fifth Avenue mansion, dining in solitary splendor while servants execute their duties with flawless precision and professional distance. After dinner, he retreats to his library, surrounded by thousands of books he has already read and diplomatic memorabilia from postings that ended decades ago. The radio occasionally provides company, though he finds the jazz incomprehensible and the comedy programs vulgar, preferring the silence that at least does not actively remind him of how completely the world has moved beyond his understanding. By 1926, as he approaches his 73rd birthday, James Roosevelt has settled into a kind of peaceful resignation about his place in the world. He will not be remembered. His contributions will be forgotten. The Roosevelt dynasty will continue its ascent, and he will be, at best, a footnote in genealogies compiled by historians interested in bloodlines rather than human experience. He organizes his papers in a futile attempt to curate his own legacy, reading the biographies of Theodore that are already appearing, searching for his own name in the indices and finding it only in passing references. He watches Franklin's star rise higher, knowing that another Roosevelt presidency is inevitable, and knowing with equal certainty that he has become what he always feared most, a living anachronism in his own family's triumph. The obsolescence he feels is not merely personal, but generational. He represents the last of a specific type of American man, the gentleman amateur who believed that character mattered more than charisma and that duty was more important than ambition. That species has become extinct, replaced by professional politicians and media celebrities who understand that power in the modern age must be seized rather than inherited. James is a ghost haunting a machine age, a daguerreotype in a world of moving pictures, perfectly preserved but utterly obsolete for any practical purpose. On January 7, 1927, as America rushed toward a future he could no longer recognize, as the stock market climbed toward heights that would soon prove catastrophic, as Franklin prepared for the campaigns that would eventually carry him to the White House, James Roosevelt would close his eyes for the final time, taking with him the last memories of a world that had already forgotten him long before his heart stopped beating. James Roosevelt died as he had lived, quietly, decorously, and without disturbing the larger currents of history that swirled around him like a river ignoring a stone. The end came in the early hours of January 7, 1927, in the upstairs chamber of his Hyde Park mansion, where he had retreated from a world that no longer required his participation. There was no dramatic final speech, no deathbed reconciliation with estranged family members, no gathering of powerful men to receive his last counsel. His passing registered as nothing more than a small vibration on the seismograph of public life, a brief tremor, measured, recorded, and then absorbed by the earth without consequence. The physician signed the death certificate with professional detachment, noting heart failure as the immediate cause, though a more honest diagnosis might have listed irrelevance as the underlying condition that had been consuming him for decades. The nurse who attended his final hours would forget his face within a fortnight, moving on to her next patient without carrying any memory of the man whose expiration she had witnessed. In the mansion's lower floors, servants went about their morning routines with the same precision they had maintained for years, understanding that this death, unlike others they had served through, would not fundamentally alter the rhythm of their employment. His obituary appeared in the New York Times on page 17, squeezed between notices of other elderly gentlemen whose names had once opened doors, but now merely filled space in the columns reserved for the recently departed. 6 paragraphs summarized 73 years of existence with the clinical efficiency of a ledger entry. The text mentioned his diplomatic service in Vienna and London, positions he had held 3 decades earlier when the world still operated according to protocols he understood. It noted his marriage to Helen Schermerhorn Astor, identifying him primarily through his wife's more illustrious lineage. It listed his memberships in the Knickerbocker Club, the Union Club, the Century Association, organizations that had once represented the commanding heights of American society, but now sounded like incantations from a vanished liturgy. What the obituary could not mention, what no respectful memorial prose could acknowledge without violating the conventions of dignified remembrance, was that James Roosevelt had once seemed destined to be the most important Roosevelt of his generation. It could not record the expectations that had surrounded his birth, the careful grooming for leadership, the strategic marriage that should have guaranteed his position at the apex of American civilization. The Times could report what James had accomplished, but not what he had failed to become, and in that editorial silence lay the entire tragedy of his existence. The funeral drew the attendance that his social standing demanded, though the gathering reflected obligation rather than genuine grief. Helen returned from Europe for the ceremony, draped in appropriate mourning attire and displaying the correct degree of dignified sorrow that her breeding required. Franklin sent flowers and a gracious note, but could not attend personally, detained by political obligations that would have seemed trivial had James been someone who actually mattered to the trajectory of American power. The church in Hyde Park, filled with elderly representatives of New York's old families, men and women who shared James's displacement and recognized in his death a preview of their own eventual obsolescence. Within a year, the material traces of his existence had begun their inexorable dissolution into the anonymity of estate sales and archive donations. The Fifth Avenue mansion was sold to new money that would redecorate according to more modern tastes. His diplomatic papers were donated to historical societies where they gathered dust in climate-controlled storage, occasionally consulted by graduate students researching minor aspects of late 19th century American foreign policy. The committees and boards he had served elected new members to fill his vacated seats, and within a single meeting cycle his absence was no longer noticed by anyone. His story illuminates a truth about American dynasties that we prefer not to acknowledge, a reality that contradicts our comfortable mythology of inherited greatness and democratic meritocracy. For every Theodore Roosevelt who seizes the spotlight through sheer force of personality and refuses to be ignored, for every Franklin who transforms physical vulnerability into political strength through acts of will, there are dozens of James Roosevelts, men and women born with every conceivable advantage except the one that matters most in a republic that worships achievement, the hunger to transcend their circumstances rather than simply inherit them. These forgotten heirs populate the margins of every great American family saga, like extras in an epic film, bearing the famous names while contributing nothing to their fame, living off accumulated capital, both financial and social, that they did nothing to create and cannot replenish. They are the Vanderbilt cousins who never built railroads, the Astor nephews who never developed real estate empires, the Morgan relations who never organized financial syndicates. They occupy the family boxes at the opera and sign their names to charitable letterheads, but they do not bend history to their will because they lack the essential ruthlessness that creation requires. James Roosevelt was not a failure by any conventional measure. He did not squander his fortune through gambling or dissipation, did not disgrace the family name through scandal or criminal behavior, did not embarrass his class through incompetence or vice. He fulfilled every obligation that his breeding imposed upon him, maintaining the standards of conduct that generations of careful cultivation had instilled. By the metrics of his own upbringing, he was a complete success, a gentleman who conducted himself with unfailing propriety throughout his 73 years on earth. But he was something far more tragic than a failure. He was a success at a game that history stopped playing. He mastered the art of being a gentleman in an age that began rewarding gladiators, perfecting the elaborate protocols of a social order that was collapsing even as he polished his performance. He became the finest example of a species that evolution had rendered obsolete, like the last passenger pigeon or the final dodo, perfectly adapted to an environment that no longer existed. James was constitutionally suited for a world of quiet influence and drawing room diplomacy, but he lived to see that world replaced by something louder, more aggressive, more democratic in its vulgarity. His existence poses uncomfortable questions about the nature of merit and destiny that scrape against our cherished beliefs about fairness and earned success. He possessed the finest education that Harvard and European finishing schools could provide, instruction that should have prepared him for leadership in any era. He commanded the most prestigious social connections, relationships with powerful families spanning 2 continents that should have guaranteed his influence. He contracted the most advantageous marriage in American society, a union that should have made him untouchable. Yet none of these advantages, accumulated and cultivated across generations of strategic planning, prepared him for the moment when the world decided that being a Roosevelt meant more than simply bearing the name, that it meant doing something memorable with it. The question his life forces us to confront is whether greatness can be inherited like real estate, passed down through bloodlines and careful breeding, or whether it must be seized anew by each generation through acts of will that cannot be taught or transmitted. James had inherited everything except the one quality that might have made him unforgettable: the savage determination to make the world acknowledge his existence, whether it wanted to or not. Theodore possessed it, that manic energy that refused to be contained by conventional boundaries. Franklin cultivated it, transforming paralysis into political strength through sheer force of personality. James never developed it because his entire upbringing had taught him that such naked ambition was vulgar, that true authority announced itself through silence rather than volume. In the harsh arithmetic of historical memory, which operates according to rules that James never understood and could not have accepted, it is not enough to be present. You must also be necessary. You must occupy a role that no one else could fill, perform a function that would create a void if you were suddenly removed from the equation. Theodore was necessary to the progressive era, embodying its energies and contradictions in ways that made him irreplaceable. Franklin would prove necessary to Depression-era America, providing the confidence and experimentation that saved democratic capitalism from its own excesses. James was never necessary to anything except the smooth operation of social machinery that would have functioned adequately with any other well-bred gentleman in his position. He was chemically inert in an age that demanded volatility, a man who preserved but did not create, who maintained but did not build, who occupied space but did not displace it. The very insulation from struggle that his wealth provided became a suffocating blanket that smothered the friction required to generate heat, light, and motion. He was ornamental rather than structural, a gargoyle on the cathedral of history rather than a pillar supporting its weight. James Roosevelt reminds us that proximity to greatness is not the same as greatness itself, that you can stand next to the fire, feel its heat, even tend its coals, without ever becoming the flame. He demonstrates that inheriting a legacy is fundamentally different from creating one. Inheritance looks backward to what has been given, while creation looks forward to what can be made. He was the Roosevelt who was always there, attending the functions and signing the documents and maintaining the connections that allowed the dynasty to flourish. But history, it turned out, needed the Roosevelts who were never satisfied with simply being there, who understood that in a democratic age, authority must be claimed rather than inherited. Today, tourists visit the Roosevelt Presidential Library in Hyde Park, walking past elaborate displays celebrating Theodore's Rough Riders and Franklin's New Deal, studying the artifacts that shaped the American century. James appears occasionally in family photographs displayed to illustrate the dynasty's genealogical depth, his face unnamed and unexplained among the crowd of relatives surrounding the men who mattered. Visitors pass his image without pausing, their attention drawn to the more dramatic figures whose stories the museum exists to tell. In death as in life, he remains present but peripheral, there but not necessary. The final image that haunts us is not of a grave or a monument, but of an empty chair in a restored Gilded Age mansion, a beautiful chair, upholstered in velvet, carved from mahogany, positioned perfectly in a room filled with golden silence. It represents James, and it represents all the forgotten heirs of American dynasties who inherited fortunes without inheriting the drive that created them. The chair sits in the late afternoon light, perfect and useless, waiting for an occupant who will never return, while outside the window, the noisy, messy, chaotic world rushes forward into a future that has no time for empty chairs or the men who might have occupied them. The image dissolves slowly to black, accompanied only by the sound of wind moving through bare branches, a lonely, hollow sound that whispers of seasons changing and time passing, carrying away the names of those who watched history happen rather than making it themselves.